Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining in and watching my podcast. Today, I'm talking about Victorian era ideology on prostitution. So, prostitution in the Victorian era was defined as the great social evil. The prostitute's world was characterized as a life of moral depravity and vice, both of which were terrifying to society at large. The Victorian era prostitute had the ability to infiltrate the public health, social, and moral sphere of the respectable middle and upper class by threatening the health of the public, introducing the allure of sin, and challenging ideas about gender and class. However, despite the Victorian era's fear of prostitution damaging the public welfare, little was done to solve the problem of sex trade at its roots, placing the blame of prostitution on the women who participated in sex work and not on the larger society's constructs that allowed prostitution to flourish. The Victorian era's problem of the great social evil was not caused by the vice and immorality of the fallen women of the lower class herself, but by the middle and upper classes' ideals regarding sexual purity, sexuality, gender, and class, and industrialization. They facilitated in the growing problem of women participating in prostitution. The double standard between men's and women's sexuality during the Victorian era helped play a part in the popularity of prostitution in the 19th century. Men were viewed as biologically and intellectually superior, while women were viewed as morally superior, thus making room for men to behave outside of the moral codes women were strictly ruled by. While women were forced to adhere to a standard of purity that limited all sexual experiences to marriage, it was commonplace for men to find sexual partners outside of wedlock. Prostitution was one of the most popular ways men can satisfy their sexual appetite that they were thought to have little to no control over. The sexual double standard would allow men to escape nearly all the blame in the problem of prostitution due to their inability to control their desire. The double standard will also put blame back on women who engaged in the sex trade, as they were believed to be operating outside the standard of proper femininity by seducing vulnerable men into sexual activity, thus allowing men to avoid the label of sexual deviant, while women were blamed due to their predisposition to vice. The way in which Victorian society viewed male sexuality gave license to men to participate in prostitution and further the problem of the great social evil. Contributing to the misconception of the cause of prostitution, Dr. William Acton's 1870s book, Prostitution, Considered in Its Moral, Social, and Sanitary Aspects in London and large cities and garrison towns, with proposals for the control and its prevention of its attendant evils. This book gives a glimpse of Victorian attitudes held on prostitution by attempting to expose the health risks associated with prostitution. While Dr. Acton does seem to take a more sympathetic standpoint on the lives of the fallen women, he fails to unearth the true issues that cause prostitution. Dr. Acton illustrates that the cause of women falling victim to sex work is not simply out of economic crisis of the lower class, but also out of the uncontrolled sexual desire and inborn sinful nature that such women are unable to control. Dr. Acton goes further into his causes of prostitution by explaining that the demand for prostitutes comes from the inability for men to get married due to harsh societal regulations, such as lack of sufficient finances, demands of employers, and the labor that marriage requires. He lists these as all contributing factors to the demand of prostitution. However, he goes on to say that such demand does not necessarily facilitate in the cause of prostitution, citing women's natural inborn sinfulness, their desire, their sexual desire, their preference to idleness rather than labor, and their love of male attention, and their inability to earn a living due to their fall from virtue as the true causes of prostitution. Dr. Acton's failure to consider how Victorian social constructs and the economic struggle of the lower class were leading causes of prostitution and places the cause of prostitution back on the fallen women of society. Further evidence of society not understanding their own influence in prostitution can be found in the Reform Advocate's Henry Matthews' 1862 book, London Labour and the London Poor. While Mayhew does consider the effects of lack of education and substantial employment have on the problem of prostitution, he disregards these social and economic issues as primary causes of prostitution and places the blame of prostitution on the prostitutes themselves, as he considers them to be immoral, lazy, and lustful. Matthew goes as far as to blame the climate for the issue of prostitution, and this is what he says. In cold climates, as in hot climates, we have shown that the passions are the main agents of producing a class of women that we have under consideration. But in temperate zones, the animal instincts are less difficult to bridle and seldom lead to a female to abandon herself to the other sex. So not only is Mayhew comparing women to animals that need to be restrained, he is also insisting that prostitution is caused by passion and climate and not the socioeconomic issue that is prevalent during the Industrial Revolution, which is just kind of hilarious because I don't think people who live in really hot or cold climates are more prone to prostitution just because of the temperature. But this just goes to show that he will do anything to blame the issue of prostitution, not on society, but on other ridiculous factors like weather. Okay, so although it seems that the majority of Victorian authors who wrote about the issue of prostitution were too deep-rooted in sexism to comprehend the societal constructs that allowed the illicit activity to flourish, James Miller offers much insight on the true origin of prostitution, even though his work is still sexist in nature. In his 1859 book, Prostitution Considered in its Relation to its Cause and Cure, Miller looks beyond the role that women play in prostitution and sheds light on the issue of poverty, lack of education, unfavorable upbringings, capitalism, and toxic masculinity. Miller goes on to say that a cure for prostitution can be found in education, reform, proper housing, women's work reform, and holding men accountable in their actions, and the elevation of the moral standard in society. Despite offering a refreshing view on the issue of prostitution, Miller still believes that women's desire to please men, their vanity, their general unintelligence, and their laziness are all strong contributing factors to the problem. Miller even goes as far as to say that women's clothing should be censored in order to prevent prostitution, as upper society's extravagant way of dressing causes envy in lower class women, pushing them into prostitution in order to afford extravagant clothing. Now, while this may have been the case, in some circumstances, it's extremely doubtful that it was a leading contributing factor to the cause of prostitution, like Miller says. Again, I can't afford a lot of designer clothing, but I'm not out here prostituting myself to get a Gucci bag. So that is just BS. So modern sources such as Judith R. Walkowitz's Prostitution and Victorian Society, Women, Class, and the State reveal the sexual double standard of Victorian England, but also the government's interventionist efforts in relieving societal ills. Now, the Contagious Disease Acts were passed in 1864, but were aimed at women entirely. The act forced women suspected of prostitution to submit to medical screening for sexually transmitted diseases, yet men were protected from mandatory screening due to their natural tendencies to seek out sexual experience. Complete double standard. No men were forced to be tested. Women were pulled off the street and held until they were able to prove that they were clean of any STDs, which is just ridiculous. But the Contagious Disease Act did do a lot of good. Despite sexism, the passing marks the beginning of government intervention into the immorality of society, which would facilitate in further government action into the welfare of society. To conclude, Examination of the research done on prostitution provides evidence that the issue was not caused by the immorality of its participants, but on the social constructs that allowed the sex trade to flourish. In most cases, women participated in prostitution in order to obtain financial security, leading to more personal freedom. Prostitution prospered due to Victorian society's failure to alleviate the issues of that industrialization caused. Lack of education, proper housing, and adequate employment were the most significant issues impacting the sex trade in Victorian England. Placing the blame of prostitution on women's supposed immorality, laziness, and vanity, and lustfulness further proves that systemic sexism creates an environment in which women are forced to participate in immoral means for survival, but then are chastised for becoming the product of the system that it has created. Thank you so much, everyone. I hope you enjoyed my presentation and enjoy your winter break.